True story. Yes, this is a true story. A North Carolina school conducted a mock slave auction. The reason I had to say true story is because when you first hear this, you may think this is fake. It is not. Several Black students were sold at the J.S. Waters Elementary School in North Carolina. One student went for $350, and another student was the slave master because he, quote unquote, knew how to handle them. According to one boy's account and his mother's Facebook post, the students also sang the N-word in harmony as they gleefully watched this most horrific act of racial violence. By now, you should all be shaking your heads and asking, how could this happen? And what can we do to prevent it from ever happening again? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Los Angeles. This is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
I wish I could say this story of a fake slave auction and racial bullying is an isolated incident, but according to one of the students involved, it is not. And that this kind of behavior has been happening at the school, that the school has a history of engaging in similar acts of racial violence and attacks towards Black students. After one parent, Ashley Palmer, reported the bullying to the school, students involved were given a 1-day suspension. At a public school board meeting, the school superintendent issued an apology to the students and disseminated an action plan to change the district's policy on how to handle discrimination, including notifying the parents, conducting an investigation, disciplining the teachers and administrators, providing training and support for the victims. You would think all of those policies would have already been in place, but apparently not in this school district. Now, there are no reports that the teachers or administrators involved in this fake slave auction have either been fired or disciplined. And although the reporting does include accounts of one of the boys being bullied after the incident, there are no more accounts of what happened. We don't know as the public what else happened with respect to this horrific account. And more importantly, did this happen because there is this nationwide push to ban the teaching of Black history, of race discrimination, of structural bias, this whole argument that we're seeing around the teaching of critical race theory? Does this have anything to do with why some teacher believed it was okay to allow her students to conduct a fake slave auction? That's the question we're asking today. Here for our leadoff discussion is Dr. Niambi Carter. She is a professor at Howard University, and she's the author of American While Black. She's a returning guest to the special report. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Carter. This story is so gut-wrenchingly unbelievable, hurtful, offensive. I mean, I can just go on and on about the adjectives. Had you heard or read about the story before today?
I had briefly, and good morning to you as well, Areva. I think all the language you use to describe this are pretty fair and probably tame for the rage that I think many of us feel when we see things like this. And we wish we could say this was the only incident like this, but we've seen moments cropping up all over. Remember, there was a teacher doing the Indian whooping or something, offending her indigenous students. I mean, there are all these kinds of incidents, and you would expect adults to behave better or just exercise a little bit more caution or better judgment. And I think that's what gets to the heart of it beyond the sort of racial insensitivity. It's just like, what are you people thinking?
Yeah, and I guess for this story, it appears that one of the kids involved goes home and tells his mom, and then the mom reports it to the school. It's not the school didn't proactively send a message home to the parents that this happened and you might want to talk to your kids, or we have some counseling available, or we're going to have a school meeting. I mean, but for this kid having the courage to talk about it to his mother and the mother then taking action, it would not have probably even been revealed to this community and to these parents.
And this is why it's so important to listen to children. I mean, because there are so many things that happen in a school day, right? The language we use now is microaggressions that these kids encounter. So maybe it's something as, overt and over the top as a slave auction, but it's also telling kids that they're stupid or they're not smart or they don't belong here, or maybe they should try to play this sport as opposed to this sport, or maybe they should try for this kind of college or trade school as opposed to this other kind of thing. These things happen to Black children and children of color daily in our school systems. And it's unfortunate that it takes a moment like this for us to really acknowledge the fact that our children are disrespected routinely in many of the educational spaces that are supposed to build them up.
And there's no link in this story to this critical race theory debate that's happening all over the country. But I can't help but wonder if teachers like this are feeling emboldened because you have this effort by state legislators and school districts and these activist parents on these school boards to ban the teaching of race, particularly any accurate teaching of it. So I want to, talk about this whole ban. First, let's talk about what critical race theory is, because I think there's so many misconceptions about what it is, and we hear the word, the phrase thrown around so often. So can you just give us like the simplest definition of it?
Well, you will probably know better than I, because it really started with legal scholars to talk about the way that race is embedded in the law. So things that look colorblind or race neutral on the face of them really do have larger racial implications. That's what critical race theory is in a nutshell. But unfortunately, as you noted, it's been sort of bastardized and just sort of taken up and bandied about by all these kinds of forces that don't want us to talk about race, period. Anything that makes people uncomfortable, in particular white people uncomfortable, is the thing that is called critical race theory. But critical race theory is a really particular kind of legal apparatus in terms of how we understand and study the law and the way that race functions. It's not being taught anywhere. But I think your bigger question is really about how poorly we teach race in this country, period. The fact that teachers, and I probably think it's something more benign. I think this teacher probably thought they were doing something cutting edge and doing something really great. They wanted to be illustrative and show people how humiliating and damaging this thing is. But if this is what passes for, dynamic teaching, then we're in a real bind here, because damaging children along the way and damaging Black children in particular to prove and to show to people why something like enslavement was so dangerous and detrimental. I think there are better ways we can go about doing that rather than have children replay this kind of racial trauma.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that critical race theory definitely is a legal construct created by legal scholars. Derek Bell, when he was at Harvard University, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's also a Harvard law graduate, they are some of the critical race theory scholars that are credited with creating this construct and teaching it in law schools to law students, to help law students understand how, as you said, colorblind policies can have racial implications. Not taught, and I learned critical race theory concepts in law school, but never in college, definitely not in high school, and definitely not in any K-8 curriculum. So you're right that the term has been broadened. So now that anything that has to do with race gets thrown under this umbrella, and it's become this really divisive term that we see members on the right, Republicans, conservatives, using to attack, assail, and really eliminate the teaching of any kind of history, accurate history of slavery, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, and the impact on today. And I can't help but think, as you just said, this teacher might have been thinking this was a good idea to illustrate how horrible slavery was. But help us understand the problem of that. Because if you haven't been teaching about race and slavery and the psychological impact of race and institutional racism and structural racism, to just out the gate say, now we're going to do a slave auction, it doesn't work. You haven't connected the dots.
Look, I think there are lots of ways to talk about treating human beings as commodities that does not single out Black children and put them in this position of being treated, even if for play, as property and demeaning their humanity in front of their peers. We know this is a hard age group anyway. So the fact that these children are now being, told to stand up, and I'm certain people are perhaps bidding on them, they're being singled out. And I think there are lots of ways to do this, right? I mean, you could take a pack of candy to show people how, people were traded like commodities. That doesn't require anyone to be singled out. That doesn't go after anyone's humanity, but to make illustrate the point that it was more lucrative to sell people individually than as bundles, for example. You can do that with a pack of Starbursts, right? You don't need to say, hey, you two, or you three, or you Black kids, you stand up here and let us look at you and turn around, and all of those things that we know come with auctions and that auctioning behavior. It boggles the mind that nobody thought that this could be traumatizing, damaging, hurtful, embarrassing, and all the other things that come with this kind of activity. And I always tell people all the time, if you don't know, just don't, right? Just don't do it, because you wouldn't or you shouldn't do that to people. I think we have a capacity for empathy that does not require us to sort of act out the sort of ugliness in order for people to understand.
Are you concerned as a college professor about these bills that restrict not just the teaching of Black history at the elementary school level, but they're going after college curriculum? States like Texas, states like Florida have passed these laws that even are trying to restrict the teaching of Black history at the college level.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's going to have a very chilling effect on university campuses, which should be these spaces of intellectual freedom. I mean, I have colleagues in places like Texas and Georgia and Florida who are really rethinking, their space in this institution, because the things that they teach are the very things that they're not allowed to talk about or shouldn't be talking about. I mean, and that's a very dangerous place, not only for faculty, because they're also in some of these places taking aims at tenure, which is there to secure faculty. And then, with the digital age where everybody's recording everything, I think people are on guard about whether they're being recorded and what kinds of lessons they present, because they don't want to be, chopped and screwed and put on the internet and have their entire intellectual life assailed. And really torn down in ways that we know can happen. And I also think, these university systems need to be really thoughtful about what they're trying to accomplish with this, because it might score political points. But when your state institutions start to take a dive, which, states, colleges do a lot of work as employers, but also as drivers of industry in that state, those students usually stay and they become workers. So if you're going after those very same professors that are going to be training those students, you should be prepared to see your university system become downgraded as a result, not because you'll have lesser talented people, but you'll have scared off the kinds of people that make intellectual environments stimulating and interesting and diverse and thoughtful places to be.
Yeah, you mentioned the tenure process. Texas actually has a bill that if professors teach race in a way that they say violates this anti-critical race theory ban, their tenure could be revoked. Federal funding or state level funding could be denied to these schools. I mean, this is the state coming into academics, controlling the curriculum, and academic freedom be damned. And that is so anti everything that we've been taught about academic institutions having that kind of freedom. So how are universities and professors like yourself, how are you going to fight back against this?
Well, look, I think you have a lot of people who are willing to resist. I think there are going to be plenty of people who vote with their feet and go to places where they don't have those same kinds of restrictions. I think you're going to see, hopefully you see university presidents and others pushing back against this, because really faculty are, along with staff and others, the real drivers of these institutions. And so you should see, I think, a concerted effort of professionals across fields. And I think you will see that coming in. And I think, tenure has been sort of under attack and maligned for a really long time by people who just don't understand what the system is. We need those protections because there are times when we talk about things that are difficult and dicey, and we should not be able or not have the ability to do our jobs because we're fearful of losing those jobs. That's why tenure is there. But, again, I don't know what institutions these people have hung around in, but they act like these universities are these liberal bastions of all this progressivism. And universities are some of the most conservative spaces ever, not necessarily ideologically, but in terms of comportment and other kinds of things. So this is really, I think, a road to nowhere and a lot of strife, and is really going to put lots of faculty, especially untenured junior faculty, in really difficult positions. And people, unfortunately, some people probably will revise their research agendas and will revise their teaching agendas just because they don't want to run afoul of the state. People need jobs, and there are too many PhDs and not enough tenure track jobs. And I think, those who can move will, and there will be others who will be forced to either stay and fight and hopefully retain their jobs, or have to sort of grin and bear it.
Yeah, I've read so many stories recently of professors who have spoken up, who have tried to assert their rights to academic freedom and their rights to develop curriculum based on sound academic principles. And many have faced retribution. Many are fearful that if they do speak up, they will face retribution. I don't know, like, where do professors go? You just mentioned those junior professors who don't have tenure. I mean, they must be even in a more precarious position.
They are. I mean, unfortunately, there's no getting around that. And the university system is built so those people are the least favored. And so if they don't have, say, the requisite senior faculty who can block for them and do some of that work to make sure that they're protected, so that when they do go up for tenure, that, what they teach is not held against them, or what they research isn't held against them, they will be in an even more dangerous position. But I think you'll see what happens in other fields, like school teachers, right? You see lots of people who are exiting the profession. I think you will see many people making that same decision because people want to ultimately work where they're respected and do work that they find meaningful. When you talk about university professors, you're talking about people who've given decades, right, to become the experts in their field, and even more to become secure in that field and become experts in their field of study. And then to have the state say arbitrarily, well, unless you do it like this, then you're no value. I think you'll have a lot of people rethinking the academic profession, which I think is already sort of seeing a bit of a decline because less likelihood to get tenure, fewer jobs than were available before on the tenure track and other kinds of things. I just think this is going to be really disastrous for university systems. And this is a really short-sighted kind of policy.
Yeah, it's these bills, some labeled Stop Woke Acts. That's the way that Florida has coined its bill, is not only trying to restrict discussions of race in schools, but also discussion of race in the workplace. Where does this end? I mean, if these state Republican conservative legislators can literally dictate what teachers are teaching, what college professors are teaching, what we talk about in the workplace, how do we ever get to a point where we can really, move the needle on structural racism? Or can we? Is that just aspirational at this point?
Well, I think it should always be our aspiration, regardless of what's happening. But I think what these people are trying to do is stop that possibility, because if we can't have open dialogue, we can't fix it, right? If we don't acknowledge it, we can't fix it. And what they're telling people like you and me and others that look like us is that our experiences, our history doesn't matter. It's not important. It doesn't tell you anything about why we are where we are. When you or I know, that's who we, right? I mean, I have parents who survived Jim Crow, right? I have grandparents who lived through that period, who didn't become voters until they were in their 40s, right? Don't tell me that doesn't matter. And don't tell me that doesn't have consequences. And really what these bills are saying is, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? Right? They're telling us that we don't have enough common sense to understand and discern the world if we can't have this racial lens. And I don't know what version of the world they want, but it's not one that I want to live in. And I think most people of good conscience will see these things for what they are, which are an end run around having difficult, hard conversations so we can do the work that we need as a nation to move beyond. Because again, we can keep ignoring it if we want to. It doesn't make it go away. It doesn't make it any less true, right? On health, to home ownership, to wealth, to educational access. Race will still be a determining factor, whether we say so or not. So we can either deal with it today or deal with it tomorrow, but it's not going away.
Yeah, and just finally, Dr. Carter, do you think we're seeing this really robust and aggressive effort to prevent the teaching of race in, like I said, elementary schools, high schools, colleges, even in the workplace, because of what we witnessed after George Floyd, because of the very multiracial coalition that protested and spoke up after the murder of George Floyd? Do you think the far right is, incensed by the fact that there were whites and folks who are consider themselves independent, not necessarily Democratic or Republicans, who stood up against the atrocity that we saw in the brutality of George Floyd?
I do think the timing is coincidental, or not coincidental, excuse me. But I also think that these are people who feel like, there should be a timetable on racial justice. That, okay, I mean, we've talked about this enough. We've done this enough. But if that's the case, then why are you trying to roll back voting rights for Black people? If that is the case, why are you trying to prevent people from migrating into the United States for better jobs and opportunities and more opportunities in life? It's this sort of notion that to expect America to be better and to hold America accountable for what this country has done and what it continues to do, to call the founding and the founding fathers into question, and the ways that sort of these documents, all of these things that make us who we say we are, into question, is somehow anti-American. And by definition, if you are a person who is not white and who has not had this sort of quintessential American experience, that your experience, which contradicts, right, many of these notions, is not valued, that it is an affront, as opposed to that might be the ultimate patriotism, being able to say, I'm an American and I still claim this country and I want to be a part of it, but I am going to hold America accountable and make America live up to its promise. That to me is what the ultimate patriotism is, not this sort of nonsense about, well, everything America does is great and wonderful, and there can be no cause to call her into question, and to say, when you've hurt someone, you repair it. That's sort of the most basic, I think, fundamental principle of humanness, not just Americanness, that if you hurt someone, you cause a damage, you have to fix the breach.
Yeah. Well, we got to leave it there, Dr. Carter. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you. Appreciate your insights. Again, your book is American While Black. That's the book now. I know you're working on a new book. Can't wait to have you back once that new book is published. My best to you in your writing. I know that can be challenging, but you are up for the challenge, and I can't wait to see what you birth in your new publication.
Thank you, Areva. And congratulations on your book as well.
Thank you. My next guest joining me is Khalilah Harris. She's a managing director, K-12 education policy at American Progress, and Chanda Robinson. Chanda is the principal of Robinson Consulting, an education consulting firm. Good morning, Chanda and Khalilah. And Chanda, I know you are a former teacher, so I want to ask you this. Help us understand how any teacher could have thought staging a mock slave auction was a good idea.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. I would ask, and that was the first time I heard it when you announced it, and I briefly Googled it while you were speaking and skimmed it. It's in Chatham County, North Carolina. What grade level was it? I didn't get the grade level, because we have to put in perspective whether it's an elementary teacher or a high school or middle school teacher.
It was elementary. That school is K through 8th, so it was elementary school kids.
Okay, so that's understandable. Elementary teachers aren't majoring in history as a high school or middle school teacher. So having the accurate historical context, contextualization, and the historical understanding. And sad to say, there are lessons out there online that teachers pull because their standards are requiring them to teach the institution of slavery. So in that, they pull this lesson thinking it is engagement, student engagement, and they begin to do it. So I think it was out of context of this teacher and not the historical understanding. We've seen lessons like that. There've been several isolated cases of pulling lessons like that. Same with the Holocaust, of having students reenact the train car rides and those kind of things. Those lessons been out there since the early 80s. And sometimes teachers Google and they read it and they see the students being up and engaged and involved, and they're required to do a student engagement. And I think that in its elementary state, the ignorance of it, I hate to say this teacher thought this was okay. I think she thought, well, I'm doing something that is engaging. I really hate to say it's been malice. As a coordinator in a district, we've had some lessons that teachers pulled, and we had to go in and do some damage and pull that back. And it wasn't out of malice. It was out of their misunderstanding of history and out of context. I don't want to jump to conclusion and say this was just pure bias and racist on this teacher's attempt. I don't wake up and say any teacher wakes up with the intent to do that. And how we safeguard from that is having districts create their own curriculum and pacing guides, having districts work in the summertime to align lessons to state required standards, pull appropriate resources. There's so many resources out there, from the Library of Congress to our documents. There's so many resources that align to the standard, and you take the time to pull your best teachers and they work and put together. Here's an example. Here's a smorgasbord of lessons that align with our district, our schools, and then put it out there for the teachers to use. Because we're also in an age now where we're pulling in people to teach and they hadn't been certified in teaching, and we're waiving certifications. So then when you get that kind of in the mix too, you got those who haven't been certified with teaching, but they have the background to do it and they pass the initial requirements to get in the classroom. So you got a combination of a lot of things going on, a lot of factors in that to get to that point of this lesson being pulled. And then lots of times there's not a district coordinator of social studies or the particular content in question to help review those lessons, help the teachers pick the appropriate lessons.
What was your initial response, Khalilah, when you heard this story? How did it strike you? And also the punishment, because we know the students got 1-day suspension. We haven't heard about any particular discipline as it relates to the teachers. And then the superintendent comes out saying, here's an action plan. And the action plan seemed like something from the 70s. Like, dude, you don't already have this plan of support, of training, of discipline. I mean, it seemed so generic, as if it was nothing.
So, thank you for having me, as always. My initial reaction and in listening to the other guests that have been on, I actually believe 9 times out of 10 things are not implicit bias and are not microaggressions, but they're aggressive. And in this situation where you have someone who is a paid professional responsible for the lives of very young children, I have a hard time believing that they could not conceptualize how this type of violence against their students is problematic, how positioning any student above another to sell them to be a slave master would be appropriate. So I truly have a hard time believing that this was not outright bias. Whether it's through ignorance or through someone's intent, the impact on the children is the same. And I'm unwilling to continue to spend a lot of time on the intent of people when the impact is so much more egregious. I'd also say that, a lot of the issues that we're seeing right now are based on very political, very nefarious attempts to really control what's happening in our schools, whether it's the Don't Say Gay ban, whether we're seeing book banning, the anti-CRT movement. All of these things are people trying to reclaim a history that was not good for most Americans, even those who seem to be prospering at the time. And I think it's important for us in our schools to be really thoughtful about why it's important for culturally responsive, culturally affirming education. But also, our public schools are populated by a global majority, overwhelmingly, but our teaching faculty are not a part of the global majority. They're mostly white. And when you have not only teachers, but school districts that are led by people who don't reflect the student population, who are not from the same communities. And I would go as far as to say it is not necessarily the case that just looking like the children is enough, because it does require the training and development to be able to affirm the children that are with you, regardless of their race or identity. When it comes to punishment, I think one day was kind of nonsensical. In this situation, I believe they required restorative practice that ensure that the children remained at school and made amends and did some learning and understanding about what happened. Even if they think they did, I think it was a good learning opportunity for the children and for faculty in that district and in that school building. So, when it comes to punishment, I do think someone should lose their job, if not multiple someones. But I also think that punishment should not be substituted from shaping a context and environment that's safe and supportive for all students. So a one-day suspension, I think, was really a performance and not intended to both help the young people who were, leading the charge of white supremacy in this lesson. And it also was not an opportunity for the students who were victimized by this lesson and their extended families to receive some restoration and acknowledgement of how they were harmed.
I'm so glad you used that term white supremacy, Dr. Harris, because one thing that's bothering me about this whole story, I found this story on a website, a story actually on CNN.com, but this was not some story that captured the nation or got, the level of attention that I thought it should have. And even the folks that wrote about it in a way that didn't scream the kind of rage that I think it should have screamed, or use the language that you just used. So I think there's this effort, even when these kinds of atrocities happen, to water them down, to downplay them, as if, teachers make mistakes, they're not perfect, they were trying. And at what point do we say enough? Because we're having this racial reckoning for the last 2 years. And I'm with you on this. Any teacher that has turned on a television or turned on their computer in the last 2 years would think differently about that kind of lesson if they really were intending to do something that was positive versus something that was hurtful or harmful to the teachers. But I do want to ask you about this, the action plan. Again, this superintendent, Chanda, says he's going to give some training. He's going to have a disciplinary policy, all things that seem like they should be in place already. Why in 2022 is a superintendent of schools laying out a plan that is so generic as if to be almost useless?
Reactionary to the public response. There wasn't a plan in place. He really didn't. At this point, teaching has just been happening in this district, and now they're in the spotlight and they're scrambling for a response, just a public response, when in all actuality, teachers understanding how to teach is continuous professional development throughout their whole career, continuously, as we evolve, as things get clearer understanding, as we uncover more information in science and everything, how we approach teaching and learning in the 21st century has to change. And he wasn't ready. We still teach 1945 industrial model teaching. Most classrooms you go in are kind of straight rows, straight approach, teacher bearer of all the information, when that's not true, when our children can Google anything now. So we have to look at the teaching and learning as facilitating and providing our students the education to evaluate and corroborate sources and do inquiry-based learning. And that's not what we're doing. We hadn't shifted. So most superintendents across the state and across the districts across this country were trained to be building managers, and they kind of evolved to those management positions. So he's just managing a crisis. He's not thinking forward thinking.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that about our school districts not really, changing or evolving. You're right. Kids can Google and they come into the classrooms with as much information and knowledge as the teachers have. Dr. Harris, let me ask you about this. I am disturbed by what appears to be this attack on public school education and curriculum by some of these right-wing parent groups. We know they are taking over school boards. They're demanding to have more control over curriculum. Many of these people are not educated themselves. They have no educational background. They're the least of the people that you'd want designing a curriculum. I mean, they just have no expertise and knowledge in it. yet they are the loudest voices. We know many of them are being recruited by these groups, these national Republican groups who are anti-vaccinations, anti-mask, anti-gay rights, anti-teaching of race, anti-everything pretty much that America stands for, but yet they're gaining control of these school boards. What does that mean for what public school is going to look like?
So we are really at an inflection point where it is time not only to resist and elevate voices of all parents. And right now what we're seeing is the word parent is equal to white woman. White suburban women, when they're parents of all stripes. And so as long as when we say parent, it means white suburban women, that's going to limit the scope, even though all white suburban women are not the same, right? So even in that space, you have very conscientious people who are being swept up under an umbrella of a very small majority of very loud people. And it's going to be important for us to be cognizant of the First Amendment constitutional rights of our children and our teachers. It's going to be important that we are adhering to Title IX when it comes to protection of students' civil rights, whether it be about gender identity, sexual orientation, disparities in school discipline by race, whatever the case may be. I know the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education is really pushing in to make sure that children's rights are being protected. Nonetheless, it's important for people to understand they're not alone. What I've been seeing across the country are faith-based coalitions, coalitions of people who are unusual suspects, unusual bedfellows coming together to say enough. Enough is enough. You all are screaming from the rooftops about what shouldn't happen in schools, but you're not actually talking about education. You're not talking about what should happen. You're not talking about a redesign that ensures that children are in schools where teachers are paid as professionals, that they are well respected, that they have the supplies necessary. We're not talking about the fact that over 50% of school buildings are crumbling or dilapidated around our children. We're not talking about the fact that you have people who are so burned out from this COVID context that they are leaving the profession. I just saw an unfortunate story about an assistant principal who committed suicide in their schoolhouse yesterday. And, we have plowed through this pandemic and then had the injustices of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's assassinations. And, we did a lot of lip service. And then when we got to masking, all of a sudden people forgot Black Lives Matter. And all of a sudden people forgot there are communities with fewer resources and that really need our support to make sure children are eating, to make sure educators are prepared. We are seeing districts that are really just trying to keep things together through using American Rescue Plan dollars or really trying to make sure that there are enough mental health providers. But when it comes to how our children are being taught, when it comes to the disrespect that educators and some school board members are receiving from members of the public, that was really emboldened, I believe, by the previous president and has been continuing to this day of a ratcheting up of hate crimes, of violence that is very much centered in bullying. We have to take control. And it's not enough for us to say, oh, those people are right wing or those people are on the fringes, because they are really not. And you're seeing a lot of people saying things out loud that they didn't say before out loud. They only said at the dinner table. And it's time for us to show up at dinner as well.
Yeah, no, you're so right. It is a minority, a small minority, but they are loud and they are organized. And like I said, they are being recruited by these groups. We were looking at one earlier called, Moms for Liberty. Sounds very innocuous, but when you look them up, they have a very, very scary agenda. They're against, like I said, Black critical race theory. They're against LGBT rights. They are trying to ban books from school. They're trying to create an environment where the history of America is taught in a way that's not consistent with the history. And we're seeing this with state legislators, Chanda, as well. Bills being passed and governors and lieutenant governors saying that they want to see history taught to our school that's aspirational and inspirational. They don't want to teach a history that links modern day systemic racism to past injustices, including chattel slavery. How is a Black teacher, and you're in this Washington Post article where Black teachers are saying they are afraid, they are under a microscope, they are afraid that everything they say will be challenged, that their students will go home and tell their parents will tell the principals, will tell the superintendents, they'll end up on social media being shamed, they'll lose their job. So how can a teacher teach in an environment where state legislators are saying, we don't want you linking slavery to anything that's happening today. We want you to talk about these issues in a way that make little white kids feel good?
Yes, that is a challenge. And right now, every state standards are listed and delineated what they should teach, the content that they should teach. None of the 50 state standards mention CRT. And most of the bills, where I looked at most of the bills, they ban CRT. So right now,
something that doesn't even exist.
That's not taught anywhere in anything. So then that's not the problem. And until the state gets rid of their approved state standards, the teacher stands on, I am teaching, and I'll just pick one of South Carolina's standards, contextualization, their experience of African Americans, Europeans, and Native Americans in South Carolina. They have to become a robot of what their standards have issued. That's my approved lesson plan. That's what I'm teaching. And until the state law changes, then I'm not teaching anything that's not within this state law. Then
and I hear you, Chanda, but here's the problem, Dr. Harris, with that. This critical race theory, we all know, it's not taught in any public schools. We've said that 100 million times. But the definition of critical race theory is being stretched to the point where it includes any mention of Black history. Some of these bills, these anti-woke bills, are defining critical race theory in a way that it's really the Black history that used to be completely acceptable. So you don't have to use the words, I'm teaching critical race theory. You can just be teaching about slavery, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, linking that to present day structural racism. And voila, someone says, oh, you're teaching critical race theory now, you're in trouble.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you scroll the Twitterverse, you will see people who are finding people's Mima and Pawpaw in their high school graduation books. And there's a reason there are some people who don't want history to be taught, because history was yesterday. It wasn't 100 or 200 years ago for those of us who experience systemic racism today. What we're also seeing is a scenario where you have people with very limited views of the world really trying to push into spaces. And on one hand, they'll say things like, I support the Second Amendment right to bear arms, but I don't support the First Amendment right to say whatever you like. Furthermore, that if I do say things that are determined to be vitriolic or hateful, you can't hold me accountable. So in many ways, it's the rules apply for you and not for me. And when we are seeing across states that have requirements for things like cultural studies, right? They have Chicano studies, they have African-American study requirements, they have the study of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, of indigenous peoples, yet they are passing these laws. The laws then begin to contradict one another. And frankly, the right does a really good job of messaging. They take a term, they write it into the ground, and unfortunately, people who should know better tend to pick up their language and try to resist their language, as opposed to demanding that they say, what is it that you want us to learn? What is it that you want children to do, as opposed to what you don't want them to do? And when you think about teaching in ways that make white children feel good, white children feel good just like all other children when they are told the truth. And kids will stick it right to you when they feel like you are hiding things from them, when they really know that the world around them is not what you're saying. It can really become problematic for your own children. And unfortunately, people's discomfort about things like how redlining and predatory lending exist today. We just saw a news article about Wells Fargo not approving the mortgages still after the 2007-2008 housing crisis, not approving the mortgages of a vast percentage of their Black applicants. Well, that is 2022. You can't say to me that that it's raining when you spit on me. I think I just saw you spit on me. So I need to believe what my eyes show me and not what you tell me. And it's important for us to make sure that our policies are supporting school district leaders, that they're supporting school principals, but the inverse also has to happen, because when we talk about standards, the standards also have been crafted in a high level of bias, frankly. The history that was already being taught was one version of history and not in depth in ways that supports all students. So I think all of those things have to come together in what we do if we want our children to be able to compete in a global economy, but also create a world that is better than the one that they live in.
You know, we've got to leave
Can I
there.
chime in?
So I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but I just want to thank both of you for your insights. Obviously, we're going to stay on this issue. It's not going away. These states are more emboldened. We're seeing laws passed across this country. Teachers are afraid. Parents are afraid. Students are speaking out. So something's going to happen. And I hope that something is a realization that, as you just said, Dr. Harris, we cannot hide the truth from our students. And the truth is not going to make white students or black students uncomfortable. The truth is going to set them all free. We know that to be the case. So again, thanks to both of you for joining me this morning on this very important topic. I got to move along now. My next guest is David Love. He's a journalist and commentator who writes about race, social justice, and inequality. And David wrote a really thoughtful op-ed piece for NBC News entitled, "What's Really Lost When Schools Only Make Black History Month Lessons Optional." Good morning and welcome, David.
Hello, Areva. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, David, I'm sure you've been listening to this conversation about what's happening in schools. You write about this, your very thoughtful op-ed piece. We were talking about this critical race theory, how this term has now become a buzzword for eliminating the teaching of all Black history. How do you think Democrats should be fighting back or responding so that this word does not become a catch-all, that people start to understand that it isn't the critical race theory that you and I learned in law school, but it is just this umbrella term that is meant to prevent the teaching of accurate American and Black history? What should that message be?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that the main point is that these Republicans who are passing these laws, they don't even know what critical race theory is. The fact of the matter is, and I think this is really what Democrats need to keep in mind, is that this is all part of an effort to really erase history, to erase Black people, people of color, and essentially to dismantle the entire civil rights, voting rights structure. I think Democrats have to keep their eye on the ball and realize this. So really, when, these folks are talking about critical race theory, what they're really talking about is this effort to go back to the past and to make sure that the evidence of the crimes that have been committed over these years, to make sure that evidence goes away so that we can't ask for reparations.
So what should the response be, David, when we hear people say, oh my God, they're teaching critical race theory, it's dividing our kids, it's this divisive presentation of American history? What should we say in response to that?
Well, we have to provide the counter narrative. We have to let people know, we have to make sure that they understand that it is important that we understand this history. What we want to do is not create robots who just regurgitate what they're taught. We need to create critical thinkers, people who understand history. We have so many problems in this nation right now that if we don't create students who are able to understand the past, we will have no way of actually solving the problems of the present and the future.
Do you think, David, that that's a message, that the message of we need to create critical thinkers, we need students who are well-versed in history, that's a message that you can use in these culture wars? It seems like people gravitate to these kind of catchy phrases, critical race theory being one of them, woke being another one, defund the police. We think of all these slogans that have caught fire and that resonate with a certain, segment of our population. But I'm not certain. It's difficult, and I'm not suggesting that you have the answer to it, because I don't think any of us have come up with a definitive response to it. But I'm just wondering, for someone like you that does a lot of research and investigation of these issues, what have you found to be? Because I don't think if you said to someone who's against critical race theory that it's important that our kids become critical thinkers, that that's a counter narrative for them that they buy.
That's a good point. I think the main problem has been that we have made Black history, ethnic studies, sort of we've compartmentalized it. We've put it off to the side, pretended like it's not part of American history as a whole. And now, when we have efforts to try to incorporate all of these themes, these messages, these important stories into the greater, into the whole, it's seen as somehow divisive, as somehow trying to indoctrinate students to teach that some people are inferior and some are superior. I believe that ultimately we have to tell people that we have to get away from these catchphrases, and we have to point to actual concepts, policies, explain to people what is real and what is important, and most of all, to help people understand that this whole critical race theory controversy, which really isn't a controversy, is actually an effort on the part of rich white folks to hide the ball, to change the subject, as they are actually perpetrating certain policies to create more inequality. They are throwing a ball to the base, critical race theory and other, made up manufactured issues, to really deflect and to really make sure that we're not paying attention to the issues that are important to us as Black people, people of color, and even white folks.
You raise a good point about the resistance coming because we've compartmentalized Black history. And as we try to integrate Black history into American history, which it is definitely American history, that's where some of the pushback is coming from. So, there are some folks who believe that Black History Month, and I had a guest on my show, a journalist from Philadelphia, who believes that Black History Month should be eliminated for that very reason, because it does create an othering of Black history, and that we should just, think of it as an integrated part of American history. What do you think about that?
Well, I do think that in many ways, Black History Month has been marginalized. When you look at the history of Black History Month, you understand that it's important to have it, because February, that's Frederick Douglass's birthday, that's Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and so on. So I would not eliminate Black History Month, because then a lot of folks in this country wouldn't learn anything about Black history, and they're not learning as much as they should anyway. But I think that we have to, it's important. I think it's instructive to have Black history as a focal point to really take a look at our achievements, not just what we encountered in slavery, but our greatness, our achievements over the years, but also as we develop curricula, and we should mandate curricula across the country that requires the teaching of Black history integrated in history as a whole, and not just something that's relegated off to the side, something for those Black folks, to keep them happy.
Yeah, I remember reading in your article that now only about 8 or 9% of the history that's taught in American history relates to African Americans. Something else that I found really shocking and disturbing in your op-ed piece was that there were 2 school districts that you found that had sent memos to their parents saying, if you want your kids they can opt out of Black History Month or teachings about Black history. Was that shocking to you that school districts were making this or trying to? I know 1 or 2 of the schools, the superintendents found out and they pulled the letter back and there was some wrangling over it. But just even the notion that they were going to allow their parents to make a decision to have their kids opt out.
Well, I think it's shocking. It was shocking to me, but not surprising, because, these laws that are being enacted across the country to criminalize CRT, what it basically is, it's an effort to just shut us all up. And the fact is that these laws are so vague, so general, people don't know exactly what it is that's being banned, what's being prohibited. So in response, they'll just say, well, we just won't talk about anything that has to do with people who are not white. And I think that's what we're seeing here, because it's really providing cover for people who don't want to teach this history of racism in this country, of race, of the achievements of Black people. But I think it's also creating some confusion among people who really don't know what they should be teaching, how they should be instructing their students.
Yeah, and that was evident in one of the Washington Post articles that Black teachers in particular are afraid. There was also an illustration in this Wash Post article that one school district had assigned their teachers to read the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?, which is a book about the psychological impact of race and how to have conversations about race. And this was done as an exercise so that the teachers could come together to have this discussion, and it backfired. Many of the white teachers refused to read the book. So they came to the exercise having not even read the book. That's how disrespectful they were. And then some of the Black teachers reported that the comments made by the white teachers were offensive, and the whole kind of thing just blew up. And I guess they found themselves not coming together, but even being more divided. And one of the things that Dr. Harris noted was that despite the fact that most schools, districts, student population reflect the melting pot of the country, school districts disproportionately have white teachers teaching minority students. And not to say that white teachers can't do a good job, or no indictment on all white teachers, but that example is pretty, illustrative of, I guess, some of the issues that public schools are seeing, where white teachers themselves are pushing back and saying, no, we're not going to read this book. No, we're not going to come to this conversation. We're going to do things the way we've always done them. Are you finding that in any of the investigative journalism that you're doing?
Well, yes, there is no question that there are some white teachers who just are insensitive to the needs of our students, and I think that's why you see in the public schools very often our students are being punished more often than white students for similar, offenses or infractions. The fact of the matter is that one of the reasons why I feel I'm honored to be a Black professor teaching journalism and media studies at Rutgers is that I'm able to interact with these students, whether Black, brown, or white, and to give them my view of the world. And I know particularly for students of color, for many of them, for some of them, perhaps they haven't had many professors of color who are able to give a particular perspective of the world. And I think it makes a big difference when students see themselves reflected in the people who teach them. And that's why, representation, while it's not the solution to everything, I think it goes a long way.
Yeah, just any final thoughts, David, on where do we go from here? Again, teachers are trying to fight back. Professors are trying to fight back, but there's fear. Fear, we heard from Dr. Carter, of retribution, of losing their jobs. There's already, an exodus from the teaching profession. Doesn't appear that these Republican legislators are going to let up anytime soon. These parent activist groups that are led by some of these Republican national organizations, they are more and more emboldened. So what is the solution forward? How do we make sure that Black history, not this fake, aspirational, white people did nothing wrong to Black people history, but real Black history, how do we ensure that it remains a vital part of the curriculum in public schools?
Well, I think what we have to do is look at this as a movement for civil rights. The fact of the matter is that ethnic studies in the late 60s started on campuses across the country and also in public schools as a result of students who advocated, who went out in the streets and fought for these things. And we have to do the same thing and connect the dots and look at this as a part of the struggle for civil rights, voting rights, and looking at all of the attacks that are coming at us. This is part of it. And we really all have to join forces and fight this.
Great, great way to end this segment. Thank you so much, David, for your insightful op-ed. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And you're right, representation does absolutely matter. Pleasure having you this morning.
Pleasure being with you.
I want to thank all of my guests this morning. These conversations are so important. So important that we come together and bring experts to help us understand what's happening. You know, we can say it a million times, critical race theory. When you hear that term, don't fall for the okie doke, as people would say. Critical race theory in its purest sense is not being taught in any public school in this country. Most of the bans, as we've heard, aren't being enacted by people that themselves even understand what critical race theory is. They don't know what it is. It's become this buzzword, this polarizing buzzword, this umbrella term that's used to really prevent the teaching of any accurate history. And I think one of the most compelling things said today was that our students, our kids go to school with so much knowledge. They're not depending on what the teachers and principals tell them. They can go to Google, they can go to social media and learn. So this effort by the small vocal minority, these very conservative right-wing activists to quell the teaching of Black history ultimately is not going to work, because kids are learning about history each and every day when they turn on their computers, when they go to their social media sites. And what are you so afraid of? What are you so afraid of? Like, why is it so scary to you that white kids and Black kids learn about slavery, learn about Jim Crow, Reconstruction, learn about the civil rights movement, learn about what has shaped this country? And really what's weird and ironic about this, white kids love Black culture. They love Black music. They love Black fashion. They love Black beauty. They love Black films and TV. They love Black folks, period. So why not give them the full experience of Blackness? Oh, such a question. Probably the $1 million question. My words to live by: knowledge is power. And don't prevent our kids from learning anything that's going to make them more powerful. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.